Welcome to Subcreation, the podcast that seeks and finds the divine in art, story, even muscle cars, and everything in between. Hello everyone, welcome back with me to another episode of Subcreation, finding the divine in art, story, and even muscle cars. I'm Dr. Troy Hinkel. Today we're going to look at a fairy tale, an actual fairy tale called the Pied Piper of Hamelin. This is an older tale, not quite as old as some, because some fairy tales go back even before Jesus, but this one goes back at least into the 13th century. There's a town in Germany called Hamelin that has in its records an account of 130 children disappearing in 1284. So there seems to be some truth behind this fairy tale historically. In fact, there is a road in Hamelin, a street that I'm not going to attempt to say in German, but in English it translates roughly as the quiet street which doesn't allow drumming, because this was the street the Pied Piper led the children down on their way out of town. So that's weird that they'd have a street named for this event. Apparently they had a church before it burnt down in the 17th century that had a stained glass window that was depicting this event. So this seems to be more than just fiction. And this is a point I want to remind us from our first episode, that fairy tales and tales that get told and handed down, it does not mean that it's just made up and that they're using story to give some kind of lesson. Usually there's some kind of truth, something deeper in there that speaks to not just universal human experience, but something specific. And the Grimm brothers themselves were very interested in capturing these tales orally before they were written down, because they wanted to capture the oral tale in its substance without changing it and altering it. This particular tale, as I was researching for this episode, has been retold so many times. There's at least 5 different versions I encountered when I was researching for this. I tried to find the original, the Grimm's brothers, and it was pretty grim. When it gets retold, a lot of times people want a little more moral clarity. And it's not that the Grimm brothers didn't want moral clarity, it's that they wanted to capture the tale as it was handed down. The word tradition comes from the word traditio, which means to hand on. And so they thought, as we capture this as purely as possible, without change, we're capturing the culture and the era in which it originated. And that interested them because they believed that that richness and that core could serve the culture of their own day. And so they wanted to preserve this tale as best as possible as how it was handed on orally. And they wrote it down. They wanted to write down exactly as they heard it. They didn't want it changed. Now, this was probably 1820s, 1830s. Soon after they wrote it, the story was made very well known by a British poet named Robert Browning, who has a beautiful poem with rhyme and interesting meter to retell this tale, and that popularized it in the English language. He did his best to try to keep it in the original, but he wanted to add some of his own verses to make his poem a little lengthier and to show his skill and how he could put it into meter and into rhyme. You can find either out there or any other version, and I recommend you do that. In fact, maybe listen to a couple different versions. But there are some basic truths that they all convey. And this is an interesting point of storytelling in general. We too oftentimes think of storytelling as, well, that's what you do with kids at the campfire. That's just a way to pass the time. Oh, maybe there's lessons in it. But for the most part, it's completely invented. That's not the way the Grimm brothers saw it. That's not the way Tolkien saw it. This is from a scholar named Joseph Pearce. And he's talking about J.R.R. Tolkien and his view of fairy tales, his view of what he called stories that were worthy of the word subcreation. This is what Joseph Pearce says about Tolkien. For modern critics, he says, a myth is merely another word for a lie or a falsehood, something which is intrinsically untrue. For Tolkien, myth had virtually the opposite meaning. It was the only way that certain transcendental truths could be expressed in intelligible form. Certainly this captures the Brothers Grimm's approach. This is why they wanted to capture these fairy tales, and they didn't do it just for children. Sure, they recognized there was a value in telling these tales to children, but they're capturing it because they believed that there were core truths that helped us locate our own story in this story that preserved a cultural heritage upon which any culture could be founded or at least develop. That these truths, these primordial truths, were speaking something truer than what could be captured in any kind of ordinary fiction. The tale itself was a chosen means because our lives are stories. And so we want the story in which to discover layered meaning and richness because that's more valuable for us. Sure, telling the lesson straight out is important. I tried doing that with my kids, but there's something richer about the story. And so these tales and tale telling was something more than just entertainment, something more than just for children. In fact, it was a way not only to bind grandparents, parents, and children, but even cultures or towns like Hamelin. And that's why this story has endured. So these layered meanings and seeking our story within the story is something that's uniquely human. Somehow we're not satisfied with merely giving the facts, ma'am, nor is it satisfying to think of our lives as disconnected and unrelated events. And there are movie directors and other storytellers who've tried doing this to some greater and some lesser degree, but it's usually not satisfying because we walk out of there thinking, okay, what was that about again? And I've seen movies like that, and I don't find them very satisfying because that's not how my life unfolds, nor anyone else that I know who's sane. You see, we recognize the difference between telling lies and truth-telling, between authenticity and counterfeit, between sanity and insanity. When we cross that line and begin moving in these other domains, that's when we start feeling the need to toy with reality, with our storytelling, and that's why Tolkien says that's not true subcreation. Now you're simply making a judgment on the world as you have found it, but don't like it. And so now you want to change it to fit your own perverse way or your own anger or your own wounds or whatever. I think that's interesting. I think there's something to that because the stories that endure by and far are connected. They're following a pattern, and then we in turn receive from that an enriching understanding of our own story, our own pattern. Because our story is tied up with our own identity. If we lose track of our story, if it's disconnected, if it makes no sense, if I can't piece it together, then I don't know who I am. I'm thinking of the movie series, all the Jason Bourne movies out there. This was really the plot, that he forgets his past and therefore he doesn't know who he is, what he's supposed to do. Meanwhile, there are people out to get him, and he's discovering these highly trained powers to stay alive, but he doesn't exactly know why. And so he's trying to piece it together. The amnesia has destroyed, or at least harmed greatly, his own identity. Another movie that comes to mind, one of my college sons had me watch this with him a number of years ago, a comedy named Hot Rod. Some of you may have seen it. If you haven't, that's okay. But it's about a young man who thinks his dad was a stuntman along with Evel Knievel. Evel Knievel was a motorcycle stuntman in the 70s when I was growing up. He used to jump buses and Grand Canyons and anything else he could jump. And he wrecked, sadly, many times, but he was well known for doing these daring deeds. So this young man thinks his father was one of those, only to find out that story wasn't true. Those weren't his origins. And of course, this creates his identity crisis. And that's the sad and the comedic side of this movie in its subplot. But both of these movies and these chain of movies show us that we need to know who we are. Our story needs to connect. And we like finding our story in other stories. That's the whole idea behind sympathy and empathy, where we can have our emotions connect with someone else's. Well, enough about story. Let's look at this particular one, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. We've already said this seems to be based on something that actually happened in the 1280s 130 children disappeared. There's record of this. There's even record that the names of these children, the names of these families, occur in Poland to this day. And there's no understanding of how from Lower Saxony this name traversed to Poland, except by some major thing, some event, some episode that would have happened in the 13th century or thereabouts. So the Pied Piper of Hamelin, the story goes like this. The townspeople of Hamelin have been infected by rats. All right, so right away, when you hear rat in a story, understand what that would mean, what it still means to many cultures today. It means disease. It means famine, because they can eat you out of house and home. It's an epidemic. It's chaotic. It's scary. I've heard stories of children who live in such poor parts of the world that the little babies have to be held by the mom, and as she falls asleep, has to pass it on to one of the older children so the rats don't come and start gnawing on the baby. This is a real scary reality. So we might not think of it in those terms in the Western world, where you just go get an exterminator. But in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, and in many parts of the world today, it's terrifying. And they amass so quickly that you quickly can be eaten out of house and home. And again, they bring all this pestilence. So this is how the story begins. Problem, right? You have something chaotic that's happening. Something that's frightening, something that's threatening. Rats. They're eating the cheese. They're eating the grist from the grist mills. They're threatening the livelihood of everyone in the town. In comes the Pied Piper. Pied means he's wearing a very colorful garb. Apparently, this is what exterminators did in the Middle Ages and beyond. It was their way of marketing. It was their way of gaining attention when they entered a town. But it wasn't just that. It was their way of saying, I'm different. And my difference means power. You are in need based on this chaotic situation, whether it's mice or rats or any other pestilence, and I'm providing you a special power, a special means to deliver you from this terrible incident, this plague, this infestation. And so these exterminators would wear these very colorful gowns, and in his case, he also has a musical instrument, the Pied Piper. He plays it. The townspeople are so desperate, they decide we're going to pay him really, really well to get us out of this trouble. And so they decide on this huge amount of sum. He agrees. He gets rid of the rats, he plays his instrument. The rats follow him. I guess the old theme of music taming the beast. And they follow him out of town. He leads them into a river and they drown. All the rats are gone. He comes back to town. The parents refuse to follow through with their promise. Another theme, promise or pledge. They pledged their word to this Pied Piper of what they're going to pay him. And now they've reneged. They've backed off. They pay him a lot less and they refuse. And because there's more of them than of him, and because the deed is already done, they think they have him over a barrel. I suppose maybe they do. Then, as the story goes, and there are different versions of this, but several older versions say it was a feast day of Saints John and Paul. These were two Roman martyrs. Those feast days on June 26th was being celebrated. The parents were all in church. According to this version, the children were not. They were playing in the streets that were now made safe by this colorful gentleman and his flute. Well, he comes back, he plays the music, leads the children down the street, out of the city, into a cave, and it closes up behind them. The parents come out of church, their children are gone, they wonder what has happened. And if you're a parent or a grandparent, you know how frantic this can be. If you've ever been in a shopping mall or at the swimming pool and you lose track of one of your little ones, it's terrifying. Well, they can't find their kids anywhere, except according to some versions, there's 2 or 3 kids that were left behind because of their disabilities. One version has one of the children was blind. He could hear music was playing, but he couldn't see where the children were going. So he gets left behind. Another child is lame and he's deaf. He can see that they're leaving. He can't hear why, and he can't follow. So he's able to see them go away. He follows as closely as he can, but by the time he gets caught up, the cave is closed and the rest of the children are gone. And so these two unfortunate children are all that's left, and they're the ones who preserve the tale for the parents. So the parents look far and wide, and they can't find their children anywhere. There is a cave outside of Saxony that has a sign over it that laments the parents' loss. So isn't it interesting that there are some historical evidence, from street names to stained glass windows to signs that hang over empty caves, closed-in caves, that seem to indicate that something must have happened. And the scholars debate amongst themselves as to what. But as I mentioned earlier, the Grimm brothers, they take this story, maybe not at face value, but they recognize it is conveying something meaningful and true. Maybe not the literal sense, but there's a deeper sense that they believe that the oral telling is conveying more than just lessons in a fable, lessons in something made up. All right, so this is the story, and kind of scary, right? So we see these themes: pledges, promises, truth-telling. Isn't it interesting? When we find ourselves in great need, when the chaotic forces overwhelm us, and we don't know what to do, and we cry out for help, we make huge promises because we know harmony from chaos comes at a cost, a sacrificial cost, and we're willing to make it at that time when we're in the midst of the trial. But when the trial is over, how fickle the human heart can be. I know I've done this many times where I'd pray for help would come, and then I'd think, did God really help me, or was it just me? Was it just circumstances? Would it have happened anyway if I'd have just been more patient? And how quickly I forget. Well, in the case of the Pied Piper, he's not so easily pleased. When the townspeople refuse to pay him the agreed amount, he takes his revenge. Another theme: vengeance, revenge. How lack of gratitude, lack of keeping your word. In an oral culture, truth-telling and pledge-keeping, promise-keeping is hugely important, as is the need to bring harmony out of chaos and the sacrifices that go with it. And those sacrifices deserve some type of just remuneration. If someone comes and helps you, and the problem that you're facing, the more they should be paid in response. And that doesn't happen. The parents are quickly fickle and forget their word. They break their word, and they lose their children. 130 of them, according to the legend. Wow. So these are the events that are taking place in here, and they are telling us deeper truths about our own life, things that we need to learn about. We need to keep our word. Let our yes be yes and our no mean no. We need to sacrifice if we're going to help bring order out of chaos. There are times in our life when the chaotic forces are too great, when we're going to need somebody who's different, who comes in and helps us. But we need to make sure that we don't treat that person the way the Pied Piper was treated. Indeed, this is the whole Christian message right here that we're seeing played out in history and then captured in this story. This is a message that plays out in our own lives, in our relationship with our loved ones, with our neighbors. This is how communities are forged. This is how communities are broken. Once we no longer trust, which is what happens when we break our word, which is what happens when we allow the forces of chaos to win the day, so to speak, to overwhelm the situation without seeking to make the sacrifices necessary. When that happens, the forces of community break down. We become isolated individuals. We're no longer bonded. This is the purpose, one of the purposes of the story, for us to be bonded, to recognize these shared experiences. Lastly, this Pied Piper, who's wearing this wild clothing and has this musical charm about him. That word to this day refers to somebody who's so charming, has such charming power to their personality. We recognize they might be sinister, because that kind of power requires a virtuous person to utilize well. The temptation is just simply too great. And in the case of the Pied Piper in the story, he has no problem taking 130 kids enslaved inside of a mountain where the cave closes in behind him. And so that name today gets used to describe charismatic figures who have maybe too much authority or wield some kind of influence over others that we can see easily can corrupt. And lastly, look at the role that music plays. The Pied Piper has a flute, has an instrument that he pipes on to play beautiful music that not only charms rats, but also charms children. It not only creates harmony, it also can create chaos. I found it interesting that the Greek philosopher Plato, one of his greatest works, in fact, this might be one of the greatest philosophical works of all time, in my opinion it is, it's called The Republic. And in this book, he talks about music and poetry, and he actually wants to ban it because he says music bypasses the reason, bypasses the intellect. It goes right to the emotion and affects the emotion and can easily lead people down the wrong path to a more loose morality. Now, he's saying this some 350 years BC. This isn't something that came out of the 1950s or 1960s when Elvis hit the stage. Plato's recognizing this 2,500 years ago almost. This was his concern. So in the Republic he was designing, that he's laying out in the book, he wanted to ban music and poetry because he was concerned about its influence on people's emotions to the point where it would override the right use of their reason, the right understanding of morality and how to behave, and would corrupt them. Interesting. And we see this in the story because the Pied Piper is able to get the children, who in some versions are playing in the street when the parents are in church, the kids are not there, and that's the vulnerability he exploits in order to relieve the parents of the love of their children. Well, I hope you go read the versions. You can look at Robert Browning's poem if you wish, or any version of it. And what I'm hoping you do with these videos as you listen to them, I want them to inspire you to invite friends over, for you to come up with your own insights and have friends together and discuss these things. I don't think we do that enough. When I was growing up, it was very common for people to just stop by unannounced. The doorbell would ring, you'd open it, it'd be a neighbor or it'd be a friend that you hadn't seen, and there they were, and you'd invite them in and go out on the patio if the weather was nice, and you would visit. That was common. In fact, if you go back to the farmhouses, that's how they were built. You had porches that wrapped around the house so that depending on the time of day, there was always shade so that you could always entertain with somebody on your porch and be cool in the shade and visit. And you'd talk about meaningful things, which for a farmer was usually weather related because it related to their livelihood. It's good for us to talk about those things, but we also need to talk about things that help us discover who we are, discover where we're going, because we understand where we've been. That's the beauty of fairy tales. And if children are present, all the better. You can read it aloud and get in a family discussion, perhaps. This is my hope for these podcasts. This is one of the reasons why I'm doing it. So I hope you do that. I hope you find your own version of this story and enjoy it the way I did. So until next time, I'm Dr. Troy Hinkel. Thank you.